The Drifter hears about a place known as the Tower, hearing about a weapon called the Bladecaster. Taking interest and wanting a break from the stress of his current mission, he accepts the task and makes it to the peak. Unfortunately for him, he'd find more stress caused than relieved by embarking on this mission. No one is meant to live forever. A Hyperlight Drifter fanfiction by Non-Toxic Markers. That's me. This looked like the place, all right. The highest peak of the tower. The view was a marvel to behold. The warm, rosy orange sky, with drops of rain seeping into the Drifter's cape and the cloth of his headgear.
This blade had better be worth all the chaos of getting up here,
he thought silently to himself. Ascending the small flight of stairs, he looked on at a monolith. Not like the monoliths activated by the deceased librarian's hologram, nor the monoliths he activated in the Cardinal Cities. No, this one was pinkish, with a red glyph-like pattern on it. Drifter could feel his head swell. The presence of Anubis's now corrupted power hung heavy in this place. Best not linger for too long. With hesitation, he approached the odd pillar, guiding his companion bot over to it to investigate. As the sprite hovered over, it seemed to charge up, activating the pillar. In too quick a second to blink an eye, the glyphs illuminated an orangey red, pulsating with its eerie light. Was this what he was looking for? All of a sudden, with a loud rumble, the staircase leading to the peak had fallen away, and the tower began to rumble and shake violently. The Drifter's head reeled, a huge wave of dizziness and pain, lurching forward as his throat and lungs tightened, and a coughing fit more violent than any other that came before it seized the Blueskin's body. Every sound he heard was drowned out, but he could still make out the large bangs as parts of the tower exploded, revealing more of those purple markings, flowing like thousands of veins with Anubis's essence. Eventually, after merely a few seconds, the white concrete shell of the structure was completely gone, and the Drifter's consciousness faded to black. Slowly but surely he awoke, eyes just barely opening, as the world around him looked like nothing but a blur. Upon rising to his feet, however, his vision cleared. The Drifter could feel a howling breeze rush through his body, a long concrete walkway leading only in one direction. Nowhere to go but forward. In his path, several blue and pink crystals lined the walkway. The world around him was an endless void of the same pink and blues, with rays of pure light shining from above, as if he was in a dilapidated building, all while a strange procession of rocks floated from the abyss below, slowly rising upward. But this odd scenery was hardly at the forefront of the Drifter's mind, only the drive to continue forward, an unexplained rage festering in his chest, with tension in his stride as he slowly walked down the narrow platform. He could hear those unholy sounds, those familiar unholy sounds, the cybernetic chittering and glitching of the beast that had preyed on him since he was first called on by Anubis. That thing that tormented him for so long, slaughtering him ruthlessly time and time again, burning the images of his body impaled on a large black spike, images of him being shot full of lasers, leaving him to bleed out of the holes they left, the images of that wretched monster crushing him like he were naught but a fly, of phasing through him and watching him collapse, of simply walking toward him, silently watching in glee as the Blueskin struggled desperately to breathe, as his lungs betrayed him. His own body had betrayed him.
No one is meant to live forever.
He is talking to himself. A mirror. He continues to walk.
What think you to be so different?
continues on. He's shaking.
Your heart beats slow. It is tired. You are tired.
He wasn't tired enough. He wasn't finished. There was a whole world he had to see. A whole world he wanted to see. By the gods, he wasn't finished yet. He refused to be finished.
This world is too big, and you are too small.
He couldn't let it get to him. He refused to accept his fate. He could not accept his fate. This world was here. This world was alive, and it would stay alive. For as long as the world would breathe, so would he.
There is no panacea. There is no cure.
There had to be. Right?
No. There is not.
The shadowy apparition appeared clear as day in front of him. A vision of himself. Charcoal cape, void black face, cyan marks, and dark red headgear. And just behind it, a large black diamond with a pink glow, watching. The drifter had seen this before. This inky shadow in the shape of himself. But this time, the clone had eyes. Bright magenta eyes. No, it was wrong. This wasn't fair. He never asked for this. Hell, he never even asked to be made at all. Why couldn't he at the very least live the life he'd been given? Why did it need to be cut so short? This wasn't fair.
Life is never fair. It only is what it always has been.
Drifter stopped walking, staring wide-eyed at the shadow. His own face shadowed by his helmet, the lighting causing his typically black eyes to shine bright white. He was trembling violently as the darkness continued to speak to him, those magenta eyes stabbing into him like needles. Slowly he approached the apparition.
But you will never accept that, will you? No, I won't.
His hoarse and quiet voice croaked, and yet despite its weakness, the rage and indignation it carried was palpable. With one swift movement, he drew his blade and sunk it into the inky body of his shadow. Suddenly feeling a jolt of pain that shook his body to the bone, his eyes widened and he looked down. The drifter was talking to his mirror, and he was attacking his mirror as well. As the very nature of one's shadow, it follows suit, having stabbed him in the same place with a copy of the exact same sword. He felt a hotness on his back as blood trickled down from his wound. As quickly as they plunged their swords into one another, they both fell back. The hard light swords still jabbed in their chests, jutting out painfully. As the drifter's senses began to swim away once more, he could hear the faint sound of his companion sprite urging him to heal. Slowly he fell to his knees, his now fading shadow doing the same, as the inky clone had given its one last cry, disappearing from sight altogether. Drifter hacked up one last splatter of blood as he fell to his side, feeling himself slipping away from the world around him, as his time was finally up. The sharp pain woke him up, feeling his senses return to him. He felt the grass below him, smelled fresh air around him, heard his companion sprite beeping at him, and his blood seeping out of him. His mind still hazy, he pondered wearily what that was. How much of that was a dream? He was in the real world, or at least not in that strange dream world anymore. Everything felt and sounded normal, but his sword was still impaled straight through his chest. Weakly, the drifter stood. This was going to hurt like a bitch. but he couldn't keep a sword stabbed through him, could he? He firmly grabbed the handle and with one swift yet pained movement yanked the sword out of his chest, yelping in agony. More blood splattered on him as it ripped back out of him. The drifter started to lose his balance, his head heavy as his eyelids as they started to droop. He heaved, leaning on his hard light blade, digging it into the ground for support while he regained his composure. After a minute or two, he took out a medkit, aiming a specific needle toward the wound. It was insanely tricky with how hazy his vision was and how shaky his hands were. And with another pained groan of agony, he shot a green foam-like gel into the wound. Feeling how it filled the wound made him even dizzier. Or maybe that was the blood loss, hard to tell. He stood there for a moment longer as the foam set, and without any hesitation, set the coordinates to warp back home immediately, knowing full well that Guardian would be a worried mess. But he could deal with that over being in a lot of pain because of this. Though, as he typed the coordinates back into the companion sprite's holoscreen, he noticed something in the corner of his eye. Another sword, differently built than his own. Wincing as he knelt down to pick it up, he realized he had totally forgotten about the blade caster. Holding in his hand, he tried it out, or tried as best as he could with his current condition, clutching it in his hand before stepping forward and throwing it with all he could without hurting himself further, which, to his credit, was still quite the lethal throw. The smaller sword knocked into a bush, tearing it apart, before quickly recoiling back to the drifter's hand. Nice. Although, he couldn't help but be reminded about a similar weapon that Guardian carries. His face looked grim with worry, hoping they didn't need to go through anything like he just did to get that. Taking a deep breath, he finished typing the coordinates in his sprite, and in a flash returned home. As he appeared on the warp pad outside of the Guardian's home, he sighed with relief, shaky with tears, and so relieved to be back after all of that. A part of him hoped that Guardian was here, so he could hug them as tightly as he could. He always missed seeing them. But another part of him deeply hoped otherwise, knowing they'd, admittedly understandably, fuss over him and ask him 100 questions all at once and worry them sick. He didn't want to burden them with all that. Fortunately, or unfortunately, Guardian was not there when he entered the home. Still out collecting modules, he guessed with a sigh. He removed his boots and headgear and collapsed into bed, staring up at the ceiling with a tightness in his chest. He felt like he was going to cry. He really did. The weight of his condition had always terrified him, enraged him, and filled him with sorrow. But the weight of it all, he felt it starting to break him. It really felt like he wasn't going to make it, that he was going to lose, that his shadow was correct. There was no hope for him, no panacea, no cure, just a ticking clock, counting down until it was all over. Drifter had felt fear. He was afraid all of his life. That beast wasn't a new thing. It took the form it did now because of what Anubis had brought him into, but it was still always there. His entire life, running from it, desperately, as he had done at the ocean when it manifested out of his own life essence being coughed up from his lungs. How he tried to fight it, only for it to mend itself and taunt him in his vain attempts. That was shown visually in his visions, but this being had been with him all this time.
Odd,
He thought to himself as he started to weep.
I figured this knowledge would serve to ease my nerves, and yet I've never felt more afraid in my life.